At Christmas dinner in my father's sprawling Texas ranch house, he stood up in front of 30 family members and business associates, looked me dead in the eye, and declared that I was a disappointment who had never accomplished anything meaningful. In my entire life, the room went silent except for the crackling of the massive stone fireplace, and I felt every pair of eyes boring into me as my 9-year-old daughter Sophie gripped my hand under the table. What my father didn't know was that at that exact moment, my phone was buzzing with a text from my assistant Jennifer that would change everything. But before I tell you how that single moment of humiliation revealed a decades-long pattern of sabotage that had been destroying my success from the shadows, and how one text message gave me the power to rewrite the entire family dynamic forever. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Marcus Thompson. I'm 38 years old. And that Christmas dinner at my father's ranch in Dripping Springs was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became the night I discovered that the man who raised me had been actively working against my success for years, all while convincing everyone around him that I was the problem. The irony is that, as he was tearing me down in front of everyone who mattered to him, the biggest deal of my career was being finalized 300 miles away in a Houston boardroom, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The whole thing started because I had made the mistake of trying to share some good news. My company, Skyline Properties, had been working for 8 months on landing a massive mixed-use development project with the city of Austin and several major tech companies. It was the kind of deal that would put my firm on the map nationally, transforming a neglected part of downtown into a smart community that would house thousands of people and create thousands of jobs. The project was worth $50 million, but more than that, it represented everything I'd been working toward since I started my company 6 years ago. After leaving the traditional construction world that my family had built their empire on, I should have known better than to bring it up. My father, Bob Thompson, had never understood what I did for a living. To him, real work meant getting your hands dirty, pouring concrete, framing houses, the kind of construction that built Texas. My grandfather had started Thompson Construction in 1947 with nothing but a truck and a shovel. And over the decades, it had grown into one of the most respected traditional construction companies in Central Texas. My brother Derek had stepped seamlessly into that world, working his way up from job sites to project management, earning my father's respect with every callus on his hands. But I had always been different. Even as a kid, I was fascinated by how buildings could be more than just structures. I wanted to create spaces that adapted to people's needs. They used technology to make life better, that solved problems instead of just filling space. When I graduated from UT with degrees in both architecture and business, my father expected me to join the family company and eventually take it over. Instead, I went to work for a tech startup in California, learning about smart building systems and sustainable development. When I came back to Austin 3 years later to start my own company, my father saw it as a betrayal of everything the Thompson name stood for. The tension had been building for years, but it exploded that Christmas night when I made the mistake of mentioning that we were close to finalizing the Austin project. My father had been holding court at the head of his massive dining table, surrounded by his business partners, longtime employees, and extended family members who all treated him like the successful patriarch he was. The table was set with my mother Carol's finest china. It's the kind that came out only for special occasions, and the whole house smelled like her famous honey-glazed ham and homemade pecan pie. Derek had just finished telling everyone about Thompson Construction's latest project, a new shopping center that would bring 200 jobs to a small town outside San Antonio. Everyone was congratulating him, talking about how he was carrying on the family tradition, how proud our grandfather would have been. My father was beaming with pride, and I could see my 9-year-old daughter Sophie watching it all with curious eyes, trying to understand why her dad never seemed to get that same kind of approval from her grandfather. That's when I made my mistake. In a moment of hope that maybe this time would be different, maybe this success would finally earn me some recognition, I spoke up during a lull in the conversation. I mentioned that Skyline Properties was about to close on the largest development deal in Austin's recent history, that we'd beaten out 5 other firms, including some national companies, and that the project would revitalize an entire section of downtown while incorporating cutting-edge sustainability features that had never been tried in Texas before. The enthusiasm in my voice died as I watched my father's expression change. His jaw tightened and he set down his wine glass with a sharp clink against the table. The conversation around us gradually faded as people sensed the shift in energy. My mother's smile became forced and nervous. Derek looked uncomfortable, staring down at his plate. Amy, my older sister, shot me a warning look that clearly said, I should stop talking, but my father wasn't done with me. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and looked at me with the same expression of disappointment I'd been seeing my entire life. Then he started talking, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never been challenged in his own house. And every word felt like a physical blow designed to cut me down in front of everyone who mattered. Marcus, my father said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet dining room like a judge delivering a verdict. You've been chasing these pipe dreams for 6 years now, and what do you have to show for it? Some fancy office in downtown Austin that you're probably hemorrhaging money on? A handful of employees who don't know the difference between real construction and computer games. Now you're telling us about some deal that you think is going to make you rich. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage in front of an audience that included his business partners, our extended family, and worst of all, my daughter. I felt Sophie small. Hand tightened around mine under the table, and I knew she was absorbing every word of this character assassination. My father wasn't just criticizing my business decisions. He was systematically dismantling my credibility as a man, as a provider, as someone worthy of respect. Bob, my mother said quietly, a gentle warning in her voice, but he waved her off, without even looking at her. No, Carol, someone needs to say this. Marcus has been floating around for years pretending to be some kind of visionary. But where are the results? Thompson Construction has been in business for 75 years. We employ over 200 people. We've built half the schools in this county, 3 hospitals, and more homes than I can count. When people see the Thompson name on a building, they know it's going to stand for 100 years. He paused to take a sip of wine, letting his words sink in while every person at that table waited to see what would come next. I could feel my face burning with humiliation, but I forced myself to stay calm, to not give him the reaction he was clearly looking for. Derek was studying his hands, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Amy looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. My mother's smile had completely disappeared, replaced by the tight-lipped expression she wore whenever my father's temper started to show. But you, he continued, pointing his finger at me across the table, you think you're better than all of that. You think there's something wrong with honest work, with building things that last? You'd rather play around with computers and solar panels and whatever other nonsense you're peddling to these tech companies will be gone in 5 years when the next fad comes along. The unfairness of it all was overwhelming. Every successful project I'd completed, every client who'd been thrilled with our work, every innovative solution we'd developed that had actually improved people's lives, none of it mattered to him. In his mind, I would always be the son who'd rejected the family legacy, who'd chosen a path he couldn't understand or respect. But what made it worse was that he was doing this in front of Sophie, teaching her that her father was someone to be ashamed of. The truth is, my father said, his voice getting louder and more confident as he sensed that no one was going to challenge him. You've never finished anything significant in your life. You started projects in college that you abandoned. You left that job in California after 3 years because you couldn't hack it in the real world. And now you're 38 years old, running a company that exists more on paper than in reality, trying to convince everyone that you're successful when we all know you're struggling just to keep the lights on. That last part stung because there was a grain of truth in it, though not in the way he meant. Building a company from scratch was incredibly difficult, especially when you were competing against established firms with decades of relationships and resources. There had been months when I'd barely made payroll, times when I'd considered giving up and finding a regular job with a steady salary, but I'd pushed through those dark periods because I believed in what we were doing, because I knew that the work we were creating was genuinely making a difference in people's lives. Problem was that my father had never bothered to learn about any of that. He'd never visited our office, never asked to see our portfolio. He's never shown the slightest interest in understanding what sustainable development meant or why smart building technology mattered. To him, anything that didn't involve steel and concrete was just playing with toys, and anyone who thought differently was deluding themselves about what real work looked like. And the worst part, he said, building to what I could sense was his grand finale, is that you're doing all of this while raising a daughter who needs stability, who needs to see her father succeeding at something real instead of chasing fantasies. Sophie deserves better than a father who can't provide for her properly because he's proud to accept that maybe the old ways of doing things actually work. The mention of Sophie was like a knife to the chest. I felt her stiffen beside me, and when I glanced down at her, I saw that her eyes were wide with confusion and hurt. She was 9 years old enough to understand that her grandfather was saying terrible things about her father, but too young to understand why or what any of it really meant. All she knew was that the man she looked up to, the person who was supposed to love and support her unconditionally, was being torn apart in front of a room full of people. My mother tried again to intervene. "Bob, I think that's enough. This is Christmas dinner, and we should be celebrating as a family." "We are celebrating as a family," he replied sharply. "We're celebrating Derek's success. We're celebrating the fact that Thompson Construction is thriving, and we're celebrating the fact that at least one of my sons understands what it means to carry on a legacy instead of running away from it." The comparison to Derek was the final insult, the capstone to a humiliation that had been building for 38 years. Derek was a good man, a competent project manager, and someone who'd found his place in the family business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But he'd never had to prove himself the way I had. He'd never had to build something from nothing, never had to innovate or take risks or fight for every client in every project. He'd stepped into a role that was waiting for him, supported by resources and relationships that had been built over decades. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up until 3 in the morning working on proposals, all the weekends I'd spent on construction sites making sure every detail was perfect, all the times I'd chosen to reinvest in the company instead of buying myself something nice. I thought about the clients who'd told me that our buildings had transformed their businesses, the employees who'd said that working for Skyline Properties was the best job they'd ever had, the awards we'd won for innovation and sustainability. None of that mattered to the man sitting at the head of this table. In his eyes, I would always be a disappointment. Someone who'd rejected everything he valued and accomplished nothing he considered worthwhile. And now he was making sure that everyone else in our family understood that perspective, creating a narrative about my life that had nothing to do with reality, but everything to do with his need to be right, about the choices he'd made and the values he'd embraced. But what hurt most of all was knowing that Sophie was absorbing all of this, that she was learning that her father was someone to be ashamed of, someone whose dreams and ambitions were just delusions. I could protect her from a lot of things, but I couldn't protect her from this moment, from the memory of watching her grandfather systematically destroy her father's reputation in front of everyone who mattered to their family. The silence that followed my father's declaration hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, thick and suffocating. The massive dining room of the Thompson Ranch House had never felt smaller or more oppressive. The walls were lined with photographs spanning 3 generations of Thompson men standing proudly next to construction projects, their hard hats gleaming in the Texas sun, their faces weathered by years of honest labor under the brutal hill country. Heat. Every image seemed to be staring down at me with the same disappointment I saw in my father's eyes. The table itself was a monument to my father's success, a massive piece of reclaimed oak that he'd commissioned from a local craftsman using wood from a barn that had stood on Thompson land for over a century. It could easily seat 20 people, and tonight it was filled to capacity with the extended Thompson family, my father's business partners, and several longtime employees who'd been invited to share in what was supposed to be a celebration of another successful year for Thompson Construction. My Uncle Jim, my father's younger brother, and the company's chief foreman, was studying the contents of his wine glass with the intense concentration of a man desperately trying to avoid eye contact. His wife, Martha, normally one of the most talkative people I knew, had suddenly become fascinated by the intricate pattern on my mother's best china. Their twin sons, both of whom worked for Thompson Construction in various capacities, looked like they wanted to disappear into the leather upholstery of their chairs. The business partners were even more uncomfortable. These were men who'd known me since I was a child, who'd watched me grow up around construction sites and company barbecues. Tom Brewster, who'd been my father's closest friend for over 20 years, was methodically cutting his ham into smaller and smaller pieces. The scraping of his knife against the plate, creating an awkward counterpoint to the crackling of the massive stone fireplace that dominated the far wall of the room. My sister Amy finally broke the unbearable tension, her voice artificially bright and cheerful in the way that only comes from years of practice at smoothing over family disasters. "Well, I think it's wonderful that both of my brothers are doing so well in their chosen fields," she said, raising her wine glass in what was clearly a desperate attempt to redirect the conversation toward safer ground. Derek with his shopping center project and Marcus with his Austin development. Different approaches, but both successful in their own ways. Amy had always been the peacemaker in our family, the diplomat who tried to find middle ground where none existed. She'd married her college boyfriend right after graduation and moved to Dallas, where she'd built a comfortable life as a stay-at-home mother of 3. Her husband Kevin worked in insurance, a steady job that my father respected, even if he didn't fully understand it. They lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, drove reliable cars, and sent their kids to good schools. Amy had found a way to live her life without challenging my father's worldview, and in return, she'd earned his approval and avoided the kind of scrutiny that had been focused on me my entire life. But her attempt at diplomacy fell flat. Wasn't interested in finding common ground or acknowledging that there might be more than one valid path to success. He'd made his judgment about my life and my choices, and he was determined to make sure everyone in that room understood exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. Derek, meanwhile, looked like he was trapped in his own personal nightmare. He'd never asked to be held up as the golden child, the son who'd done everything right. We'd actually had a good relationship when we were younger, despite the 4-year age gap between us. He'd taught me how to throw a football, how to bait a fishing hook, how to change the oil in a pickup truck. But as we'd gotten older and our career paths had diverged, my father had increasingly used Derek's success as a weapon against me, turning our natural sibling relationship into a competition that neither of us had wanted. Now Derek was squirming in his chair, clearly wishing that his latest project hadn't been the subject of such enthusiastic praise. Just minutes before my father had launched into his character assassination, he caught my eye for just a moment, and I saw genuine regret there, along with the helpless frustration of someone who wanted to speak up but didn't have the courage to challenge. The man who controlled both their livelihood and their family dynamics. My mother Carol was perhaps the most tragic figure at that table. She'd spent 35 years of marriage learning to navigate my father's moods, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense when a situation was about to explode and to either diffuse it or get out of the way. Tonight, she'd been blindsided by the sudden turn in conversation, and now she was trapped between her loyalty to her husband and her love for her son. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the stress lines around her eyes. Her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. The ranch house itself seemed to be holding its breath. This was the house where my father had brought my mother as a young bride, where he'd raised his children, where he'd entertained clients and celebrated business successes. Every room was a testament to his achievements, filled with furniture and artwork that spoke of prosperity, earned through hard work and traditional values. The massive Christmas tree in the corner of the dining room was decorated with ornaments that told the story of our family's history, including several that had been handmade by me and my siblings when we were children. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rolling hills of the Texas hill country stretched away into darkness, dotted with the lights of other ranch houses where other successful families were probably sharing their own Christmas celebrations. The property itself was over 200 acres, most of it still working ranchland, where my father kept a small herd of cattle more for tradition than profit. He'd bought the land piece by piece over the years as Thompson Construction had grown and prospered, turning it into a symbol of everything he'd achieved and everything he valued. But tonight, all of that success and tradition felt like a prison. The very walls seemed to be closing in on me, reinforcing my father's narrative about what success looked like and where I fit into that picture. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration was evidence supporting his case that real achievement looked like what he'd built. It's not like what I was trying to create. Sophie was still gripping my hand under the table, her small fingers intertwined with mine like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. I could feel her confusion and hurt radiating from her tiny frame, and I knew that this moment was being burned into her memory in ways that would shape how she thought about family and loyalty and the price of standing up for yourself. She was learning that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who can hurt you most deeply. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 o'clock, its deep resonant tone echoing through the house like a funeral bell. The sound seemed to snap everyone back to awareness of where they were and what was happening, but nobody seemed to know how to move forward from this moment. The conversation had reached a point of no return, a place where anything anyone said would either escalate the confrontation or reveal their own cowardice in the face of my father's bullying. That's when I felt the vibration in my pocket. The vibration against my leg was subtle, barely noticeable through the fabric of my dress pants. But in that moment of absolute silence, it felt as significant as an earthquake. My phone was buzzing, with what was probably just another routine notification, maybe a social media update or a spam email, but the timing felt almost supernatural. Here I was, sitting at my father's table, being systematically destroyed in front of everyone who mattered to him. And somewhere in the digital world, my life was continuing to move forward, whether he approved of it or not. I didn't reach for it. The phone immediately. Years of training in client meetings and professional presentations had taught me that checking your device during important conversations was the height of disrespect. And despite everything my father had just said about me, I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of proving that I lacked basic manners. Instead, I forced myself to maintain eye contact with him, to show that his words had landed but hadn't broken me, that I was still capable of holding my ground even when the ground itself felt like it was crumbling beneath my feet. But the phone buzzed again, and then a third time in quick succession. 3 messages in the span of 30 seconds meant something important was happening, something that couldn't wait for normal business hours or polite social conventions. My assistant Jennifer Martinez was one of only 5 people who had permission to reach me during family time, and she would never abuse that privilege unless there was a genuine emergency or an opportunity that required immediate attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my father was lecturing the entire room about my failures and delusions, the business he dismissed as a fantasy was operating at a level of professionalism and success that would have impressed him if he'd ever bothered to pay attention. Jennifer was the best assistant I'd ever worked with. A former project manager from a major Houston development firm who joined Skyline Properties because she believed in our vision of creating smarter, sustainable communities. She was brilliant, meticulous, and completely devoted to the success of our company. More than that, she understood the significance of the deal we'd been working on for the past 8 months. The Austin Central District project wasn't just another development opportunity. It was the kind of transformative urban planning initiative that could redefine how cities approached growth and sustainability. We'd been competing against firms with 10 times our resources and 50 times our name recognition. Companies that had built skyscrapers in Manhattan and luxury resorts in Dubai. The project called for a mixed-use development on 12 acres of underutilized land just east of downtown Austin, an area that had been struggling with urban decay for decades, but was perfectly positioned to become a bridge between the traditional downtown core and the emerging tech corridors that were transforming the city's economy. Our proposal wasn't just about constructing buildings. It was about creating a living ecosystem that would include affordable housing, commercial space, green areas, and community amenities, all integrated with cutting-edge technology that would reduce energy consumption, improve air quality, and enhance the quality of life for thousands of residents. The competition had been brutal. We'd spent months crafting our proposal, working 18-hour days to develop architectural plans, financial projections, sustainability metrics, and community impact studies that would set us apart from the established players. I'd personally invested every dollar of profit from our previous projects into developing the most comprehensive proposal we'd ever created, betting everything on the belief that innovation and vision would triumph over reputation and resources. But it wasn't just about the money. $50 million would certainly transform Skyline Properties from a small regional firm into a major player in the Texas development market. It was about validation, about proving that the approach we'd been pioneering actually worked in the real world, about demonstrating that sustainable development wasn't just an idealistic fantasy, but a practical solution to the challenges facing growing cities. More personally, it was about proving my father wrong. Every dismissive comment he'd ever made about my career, every time he'd suggested that I was chasing pipe dreams instead of building something real, every occasion when he'd implied that I was too impractical to succeed in the business world, all of that would be answered by this single project. Not because I needed his approval, but because I needed to know for my own peace of mind that I hadn't wasted the last 6 years of my life pursuing something that would ultimately lead nowhere. The phone buzzed a fourth time, and I saw my uncle. Jim glanced down at my pocket with a puzzled expression. The sound was barely audible, but in the oppressive silence that had settled over the dining room, even the smallest disruption felt significant. My father had finished his speech but was still glaring at me across the table, waiting for some kind of response, some acknowledgement of his superior wisdom and insight into my character. I thought about the countless nights I'd spent in our office, working by the light of my laptop screen while the cleaning crew worked around me, refining proposals and reviewing contracts and strategizing about how to position our company for opportunities like this one. I thought about the team of architects, engineers, and project managers who joined Skyline Properties because they shared my vision of what development could become. People who'd left secure positions at established firms to take a risk on something unproven and uncertain. I thought about Sophie, sitting beside me, absorbing every word of this character assassination, learning that her father was someone to be ashamed of rather than proud of. She was too young to understand the complexities of business or family dynamics, but she was old enough to recognize the tone of disappointment and dismissal in her grandfather's voice. She was learning that success was defined not by innovation or impact, but by conformity to established patterns, that taking risks and pursuing new ideas was something to be discouraged rather than celebrated. The phone buzzed again, more insistently. This time, and I realized that whatever was happening in Houston or Austin or wherever our business was unfolding, it was happening right now while I sat in this dining room being lectured about my inadequacies. The contrast was almost surreal here in this house, filled with photographs of construction projects from the past. I was being told that my future was built on fantasies, while in the real world, that future might be crystallizing into something more concrete than anything my father had ever built. I could feel the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on me. My father expected me to either defend myself poorly or apologize for my life choices. My mother expected me to smooth things over and restore peace to her Christmas dinner. Derek expected me to handle this confrontation without dragging him into it or forcing him to choose sides. Amy expected me to be reasonable and diplomatic, to find some way to bridge the gap between my father's worldview and my own reality. But what they all failed to understand was that this moment wasn't really about them or their expectations. It was about the choice between accepting someone else's definition of my worth or insisting on my own right to determine what success looked like for my life and my daughter's future. The phone buzzed one more time, and I made my decision. I pulled out my phone and glanced at the screen. The messages were from Jennifer, and the preview of the first one made my heart stop. "Sir, the $50 million deal is confirmed." I opened the full message thread, my hands trembling slightly as I read the details. The Austin Central District project was ours. The city council had voted unanimously. The contracts were being finalized. Everything we'd worked for, everything we'd risked, had just paid off in the most spectacular way possible. I looked up at my father, who was still glaring at me with that familiar expression of disappointment and superiority. The same man who had just spent 10 minutes explaining to a room full of people that I was a failure, that my business was a fantasy, that I would never amount to anything meaningful. I stood up slowly, Sophie's hand still in mine, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely calm in his presence. "You're right about one thing, Dad," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I am different from you. I don't measure success by how well I can tear other people down." Held up my phone so everyone could see the screen. "My company just won the largest development contract in Austin's history, $50 million. But more importantly, we're going to build something that will improve thousands of lives for generations to come." The room was dead silent. My father's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like respect. But it was too late for that. Sophie squeezed my hand and looked up at me with pride shining in her eyes, and I realized that her opinion was the only one that had ever truly mattered. I helped Sophie down from her chair and headed toward the door. We had our own celebrating to do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.